Spider-Man Unlimited is the kind of sort of spiritual successor to Spider-Man the Animated Series for a variety of reasons that you can go view one of the popular retrospectives on this series. You can learn about why this series had to go in a completely original direction, but just to kind of summarize it, it happens to do with the fact that the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogies deal that had gotten done in the late 90s precluded this show from using many of the common or typical comic storylines and depictions of characters that would possibly get used in those films. So that led to this show having a completely original, never done before storyline that is so out of left field that it results in this particular show. This show is 13 episodes long, so this best episodes review is also going to contain just my overall series review, because why not? At this point, Spider-Man cartoons had become serialized. The Spider-Man the Animated Series was also serialized, and that was like the first one to kind of get this going. And so this follows that trajectory by having an overall story and narrative with a through line that continues throughout the entire season. Therefore, it makes it a little hard to just have a best episode review when those episodes exist in the context of the entire show. So I will give a best episode review for this show, as well as an overall review of the series. This episode does stand alone and work pretty well on its own, but you'd be a little bit confused as to how we got here if you only just watched this one. Episode 11 is titled "One is the Loneliest Number" and is the highest reviewed episode of the series according to IMDb. It has a 6.6 out of 10 rating on the series, which admittedly not high. And if that's the high bar for the series, that kind of tells you what the overall reception to this series is. And this episode is part of some production issues in that it's titled or appears as episode 11, but in terms of the story, it should actually be viewed as the 10th episode. And so the proper viewing order is, 1 through 9, then you should watch episode 11, then go back and watch episode 10, and then continue with 12 and 13. And episode 10 will make references to things that happened in episode 11. So I think it's just best to watch this before episode 10 if you plan on viewing all of them. This episode features Venom and Carnage, how they managed to skirt the rights issues that were imposed, and how, their adaptations managed to be sanctioned for the show. It's kind of beyond me, but it's cool that they're in here. And off the bat, Venom's design is mostly what we're used to, with Carnage having the most varied design. He looks more skeletal. One thing that I've noticed is both of these characters do have like bony spikes kind of pointing out of them. And this show overall tends to like to do that. They have a lot of characters with these bony spikes. I don't really know why, but even the big bad of this series, the High Evolutionary, also has that. And it doesn't really add anything to the costume except to just do it. But I don't really understand this show's obsession with that. Now, the premise of this series is that Peter Parker travels to Counter Earth, which is very much like the depiction from Guardians of the Galaxy 3, in that it's an Earth very similar to our own, with just some minor differences. The difference namely being that the High Evolutionary traveled to Counter Earth and imposed his will in terms of, viewing humans as an inferior creature, and instead conducts experiments on animals, turning them into some higher order being called the Bestials. The Bestials then become like the typical kind of standard class in this society, with humans being the oppressed and subjugated class in here. And so they get into almost this kind of like X-Men territory, where the humans are hunted and subjugated via machine men, kind of like the Sentinels in this show. And so this story is very similar or somewhat reminiscent of Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And if you've seen that film, you're going to start to pick up on things in this show that is seemingly adapted into the films, or is at the very least a typical story when it concerns the High Evolutionary. But up until this point, Venom and Carnage have been concocting their own plan to kind of subjugate the humans on this planet as well, and the High Evolutionary views them as a threat to his overall plan. So the High Evolutionary has his machine men attack Venom, and through the use of some sonic rays, manage to separate Venom from his host, Eddie Brock. Now, this is the first time in the series that we even realize that Eddie is Venom. That, of course, is standard, but this show tends to have Venom and Carnage ooze around and move in ways that, we typically don't see them do when they have their hosts. So this kind of made it look like they were just purely the symbiotes. Whereas, in fact, when we see them separate, we see that Venom did, in fact, have his host, Eddie Brock, on this planet. Peter sees this and sees that Eddie is struggling and just about left to die. So he takes him to the doctor's residence that Peter has been staying at this whole time. When Eddie doesn't have his symbiote, he's going through withdrawals, and it's very excruciating and painful to see, which I think is a plus for this show. I think that's a cool way to show the toll that it's taking on him, almost like a drug addict being in withdrawals from being sober for a period of time. So I think that's a really cool way to depict it and their relationship. Spider-Man then goes to the High Evolutionary's lab to go steal the symbiote in order to bring it back to Eddie so that it can keep him alive. As a result, when Spider-Man obtains the symbiote, he then dons it in order to keep the actual symbiote alive, because it seems like he can't really survive without its host in this version. So he puts it on, and it's this cool classic imagery that we've seen, very similar to the animated series, honestly. And they give a flashback to show basically a summary of the Black Suit saga, which is Peter letting go of that costume, it taking a hold of Eddie and turning him into Venom, and then it kind of summarizes their relationship very quick in a flashback, but very cool to see. And it's done differently than the animated series, which again is kind of this nod to the fact that this show isn't really meant to be a successor to that. It doesn't show the scenarios in the exact same way. However, Carnage, on the other hand, senses that Venom has lost its host and has become weaker, and so in order to go forward with their plan, goes to find Eddie and the Venom and reunite them in order to continue with their plan to subjugate all of the humans. As a result, Carnage threatens the doctor's family that has been caring for Eddie, and Eddie at this point has kind of familiarized himself with them and even rejected or opposed the idea of reuniting with Venom. The cool thing I liked about this show is that they humanized Eddie a bit more, and we glitz past the relationship that Eddie and Spider-Man had previously had. We can tell that there was friction and there was a history there. But we get to this point and we see that, Brock is pretty much done with this. He doesn't want anything to do with it. It's caused him a ton of pain, and he's been taken over and consumed by this Venom symbiote. And at this point, he's really ingratiating himself and opening up to the humans that have taken care of him. And you get the impression that he's willing to leave that behind. However, the only way for him to protect those humans from Carnage is to take on that Venom suit and start fighting Carnage. And once he puts that suit back on, he does start fighting Carnage, and then kind of instantly, after just a few moments, starts fighting back against Spider-Man and the machine men that are attacking him. He goes through this mentality shift, which makes sense. It makes sense that, as the Venom suit is reintegrating with him, that he would start shifting his perspective from trying to protect the humans and fighting Carnage to going back to fulfilling their ultimate plan, the symbiote's ultimate plan. That being said, it happens too quick, and we don't really get to see that transition. We don't get to see that struggle really depicted in this show. And so as a result of that, it just feels a little bit jarring and a bit instantaneous. Now, a reason I think that this episode probably is the best reviewed one is because it's the closest one from amongst the entire series that resembles a Spider-Man story that we're familiar with. This separation of Eddie from the Venom and his battle with donning the costume again is something that's been depicted in comics and has been depicted in Spider-Man the Animated Series. Admittedly, it feels almost too similar to the episode from Spider-Man the Animated Series in which Eddie had given up the Venom symbiote but then decided to put it back on only to save people that he cares about. It ends in a very familiar territory, and so I think that the animated series had even done the concept better. It works in the context of this show and works in this episode, but it wasn't nearly done as well as the animated series. To that credit, though, I still respect and admire the fact that this show shows the toll that the symbiote takes on Eddie, both in his psyche and in his body. It really does seem like an excruciating relationship, one that at this point, he doesn't seem to get any satisfaction of power or anything like that from it. Instead, it just seems like it's consumed him and it's something that he's unwillingly taking just in order to protect others. It kind of humanizes, and the story is admittedly solid here, but is something that I feel is weaker in comparison to when it's been done in other cartoons and in other mediums. I'd have been maybe more interested in this episode's depiction of it if the series had itself established some sort of relationship between Spider-Man and Venom and not tried to rely on previous incarnations to sell you on this. This all seems just a bit too sudden, and of course, the time length of this show lends itself to having to move pretty quickly. But we've seen what other cartoons, that are set in this 24-minute, 20-ish minute time frame are still able to convey those senses of emotion and history and make you empathize and care about these characters. And this show, unfortunately, doesn't do as much service to the history of these characters. I also think they probably could have benefited by going in a new direction entirely, just perhaps not reaching the same conclusion that we've seen done before. I think something more novel could have been like having Eddie choose to separate from Venom and stay away from that. Instead, maybe joining the overall movement that has been brewing in this show. I haven't really touched on it, but there is this rebellion, revolution factor to the show in which the humans are sort of revolting against the high evolutionaries' oppression of them. And so getting to see Eddie join that movement along with the other humans that we've seen, and along with Spider-Man, etc., would have been something interesting, and I think endeared us more to the character. It would have been a way to make this episode not feel like just a one-off, but feel like it has connective tissue and importance to the overall narrative. Now, getting into the review of the series as a whole, I mentioned that Spider-Man does travel to Counter-Earth, but I didn't really get into much detail about why. The purpose for this is to go on a rescue mission for J. Jonah Jameson's son, John Jameson, the astronaut. I also mentioned that on Counter-Earth, humans are treated as second-class citizens, second-class species, really, with the bestials, these creatures that the High Evolutionary has created and experimented on, being the first-class species. So this show tackles ideas of oppression and freedom and rebellion and gets into kind of X-Men territory, as I said before, with, having these agents of oppression being the High Evolutionary, his guard force, as well as these machine men that operate very similarly to the Sentinels. Now, while they don't seem to always, just be on the lookout trying to attack humans, they, at a whim, seem to be trying to oppress them and force them into their confines and rules that, don't necessarily apply to the bestials. Since Jameson has arrived on the planet, he is actually joined and is now the leader of this rebellious group of humans that are trying to combat and take down the High Evolutionary. This premise alone is wildly different from anything we've seen in any of the Spider-Man cartoons to date, and really up until this point in 2025, I don't think we've seen a show like this, a Marvel cartoon, really venture so far out of left field from what is kind of typical. They could do an arc like this, maybe here and there, just a little side story, 2 to 3 episode miniseries sometimes within a show, but to have an entire series dedicated to this off-world adventure is very different, and I can respect that. However, the premise would have you believe that this rebellion would have some long-standing goal to probably tackle and topple the High Evolutionaries' rule over this counter Earth. And unfortunately, while there's vague semblances of that, the show never really concerns itself with walking you through the stages of these different attempts that are building to this ultimate dismantling of the High Evolutionaries' control of Counter Earth. Rather, there doesn't seem to be this grand plan, and is instead more of this random mission of the week that is trying to be this thorn in the side of the High Evolutionary. And as a result, the successes that we see in this show don't seem to be building towards some overall goal, and we never really see the momentum swing in either direction. And rather than build towards an ultimate confrontation that'll determine the fate of the humans on Counter Earth, we get sort of this plot and ultimate showdown where the High Evolutionary is just kind of fed up with various groups trying to enact their control. You know, you got the symbiotes who have concocted this plan to, as I mentioned, mass control society. And then you have the rebellious humans try to fight back and eat away at the High Evolutionaries' domination of society. And he just decides to have an all-out assault because he doesn't want to deal with it anymore, which is fine, except that there's been no build-up to this. Likewise, the episodes tend to have Spider-Man go through the same moral quandaries and dilemmas about whether he should be helping these humans in their revolution or whether he should be trying to get back home as soon as possible. He seems to tackle these over and over again, but comes to the same conclusion every time, the same conclusion that we'd expect, which is that, you know, he sees someone that's being downtrodden, so he's going to try to help them out. As a result, the dilemma fails to feel real and is just this reoccurring situation in which we never feel like he'd actually consider an alternative. That being said, they do nail the portrayal of Spider-Man, and in fact, this show gives him a great suit out of it as well. That's probably the best thing to come out of this show. The second best thing is probably Rino Romano's voice acting, because if you remember him from the PlayStation 1 era games, he did the voice for those and is, one of my favorite voices for Spider-Man, and it's great to see him get to do that in this show as well. Now, the voice direction seems to be just a bit hit and miss at times, just the emotion doesn't seem to match the situations, but the voice acting itself is stellar and just as much what we'd expect from Rino Romano. And his quips are genuinely funny and just often occurring. They fly so much, and that is a positive for me, that I think they really nail down Spider-Man's humor and quips and makes it feel just in line with any other incarnation that we've had. The show also does have little flourishes like the comics text bubbles and just the location details, as well as the opening that is done in this like comic panel style that I think just nails the character and is a creative choice that I admire. And this portrayal of Spider-Man is honestly such a high point that it is enough to keep me coming back to the series despite all of the flaws that it has. And it even makes me wish that it didn't end on the cliffhanger that it does. Now, I am aware that some plot details had emerged that go on to explain what would happen in an eventual second season, and it seems to be that the second season would continue the trend of the first season, which is that you don't really get to sit with emotions and the stakes that happen. It seems like this cliffhanger would have gotten resolved relatively quickly. I think he said like in the first 2 to 3 episodes, which for how large of a scale that this cliffhanger is, seems a bit preposterous. But again, this show tends to move quick and tends to not concern itself much with an overall narrative that, I guess I could see that happening. But ultimately, I get it, and that doesn't stop me from wishing that we could have seen that second season as well. I also didn't really touch much on the High Evolutionary, and that's because in this show, he's just okay as a villain. You know, the Guardians of the Galaxy 3, I think, does a really good job of depicting that character and his backstory and making you feel and understand his motivations, as crazy as they are. This show doesn't really flesh out his motives, and they try to give you a few little flashbacks about his backstory in like the final two episodes, but that's not enough for you to view him as a complex character with grand motivations and reasons for these motivations beyond just kind of the cookie cutter, simplistic, humans bad type of angle that they seem to want to go with. His design is interesting, I guess. Again, I don't know why they went with these bony spikes situation, but they're fine. I think it's a better look and depiction than what we had in X-Men, the animated series. That one served its purpose, but I tend to like this one a bit more. And, he's supposed to be this immensely powerful being with telekinetic powers. We don't really get any history on where that comes from or why he's the way that he is. But he ends up getting taken out in a very anticlimactic way, and it personally diminishes any of the respect or like fear of that character when he gets taken out like that. Now, other villains do show up in this show, like Green Goblin, Vulture, Electro, and Kraven the Hunter, though Kraven is kind of depicted a little differently, and I think his depiction in this show is one of the best revisions besides Spider-Man. They have him called just the Hunter, but he retains a lot of that Kraven energy, but is done slightly different in a way that I think works. The Green Goblin and Vulture look so similarly that I thought that they were the same character. Like, obviously, they're referred to as different characters, but I thought, he had just taken up a new persona. And then Electro is just wildly different. He's just a creature, like an electric eel type, that is way out of left field and, works for the show, but I don't think he's anything to write home about. And that's my collective thoughts on the show as well as the best episode in the series. I think the show has a decent number of positives and definitely some negatives, but it still left me wanting more in almost like a sunk cost fallacy kind of way. But I think it's ultimately a show that's going to be nostalgic if you grew up watching it, and it's going to be pretty bad if you are just coming to this series with 2025 lens. It's the forgotten or overlooked series in Spider-Man's history, and despite being added to Disney Plus, I think it's still going to remain that way. The show has more of a vibe of a comic miniseries, as I mentioned, and in that way, it's pretty cool to see because we definitely don't get many of them. It's just so unique, and this commitment to such an out of left field creative idea is something that we don't really see anymore. And, maybe the show's part of the reason why, because it leads to something that is just kind of underbaked. It's a strange show for sure, but this was a fun experience, and I'm looking forward to covering the next series, Spider-Man, the new animated series, not to be confused with the one from the 90s. This is the MTV Spider-Man series. I watched a portion of that show growing up, and I did happen to like it, though I understood some of the criticisms about its animation style. I like that it was a bit different personally, but we'll save that for the review of that series. And that's one that I'm thinking I'm going to tackle in this similar way of doing the best episode review as well as the series in its entirety, because I think that one's like 20 episodes long. So definitely enough that, you can kind of get through it relatively quickly. So I'll give that one the same treatment. That'll do it for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.